A raft, the open Pacific. 3 men, and nothing else? No land in sight, no ship on the horizon. Just water, silence, and 6 bars of chocolate that were never supposed to be delicious. Because delicious chocolate gets eaten too soon. And soon, out here, means death. Somebody designed this chocolate to fail on purpose. Not the recipe, the taste. An army captain gave one impossible order. Make it edible, but never make it good. Good enough to survive on. Bad enough that no one would touch it until there was truly nothing left. A Hershey chemist took that order and built something the food industry had never attempted before. A bar engineered to resist jungle heat, Arctic cold, and years on a warehouse shelf, while tasting, by military design, barely better than a boiled potato. It rode in the pockets of men crawling through the frozen forests of the Battle of the Bulge. It sat in Red Cross parcels smuggled into German POW camps. It waited silently inside a life raft drifting hundreds of miles from land, where one man would eat all of it in a single night and pay for it with his life. Today, I'm making that exact bar from the real 1937 military formula. I'm going to taste it exactly as those soldiers did, and I'm going to tell you what happened on that raft. Because not everyone survived to tell it themselves. Welcome back to Savoring History, the channel where we don't just tell you what people ate throughout history. We cook it, we taste it, and we live it. One recipe at a time. If this is your first time here, you are about to fall down a very delicious rabbit hole. Because every week, we dig up a forgotten dish from the past, recreate it in this kitchen using the original methods and ingredients whenever possible, and then find out whether history got it right. Today's story takes us into the darkest, hungriest corners of the Second World War, where a piece of chocolate was not a treat. It was a lifeline. We are going to trace this bar from a failed experiment in the 1930s all the way to a life raft in the Pacific, a POW camp in Germany, and a snowy forest during one of the bloodiest battles in American history. And yes, at the end, I am going to make it myself using the real wartime recipe and taste it for you. But before we get into it, I need your help with something. If you are new here, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because this channel is building an entire series on military rations from World War II. American, British, German, Soviet, Japanese. And you do not want to miss a single one. If you are already part of the Savoring History family, smash that like button right now. It genuinely helps this channel more than you know. And here is what I really want from you today. Down in the comments, tell me what country and what city you are watching from. I love seeing just how far this kitchen reaches, and I read every single one of them. Are you watching from a rainy afternoon in London, a late night in Sao Paulo, or a lunch break in Manila? Let me know. Now, let's go back to 1937, to a failed chocolate bar, a stubborn army captain, and the recipe that would change military history forever. Every great invention has a failure hiding behind it, and this story is no exception. Long before soldiers were carrying this famous emergency ration into combat, the United States Army had already tried, and spectacularly failed, to solve the same problem. Back in 1932, the cavalry needed something calorie-dense that troops could carry into the field. And the answer they came up with was a 12-ounce chocolate bar made almost entirely of chocolate, sugar, and peanut butter. On paper, it sounds fantastic. In practice, it was an emergency ration in name only. The bar was so rich in fat and salt that any soldier who actually ate it became painfully, dangerously thirsty within the hour. which defeats the entire purpose of a ration meant to be eaten in places where water is often scarce. Worse still, the fat content meant the bar turned rancid within a couple of months. So by the time it might actually be needed in a real emergency, it had often already spoiled in the supply crate. The Army had learned an expensive lesson. A ration that tastes wonderful is not automatically a ration that works. Delicious and reliable are not the same thing. And in the brutal logistics of modern warfare, reliability wins every single time. Somebody needed to start over from scratch. And that responsibility eventually landed on the shoulders of a young officer named Paul Logan. Logan was working at the Army's Subsistence Research Laboratory in Chicago, and he had almost certainly heard every complaint about that failed cavalry bar firsthand. Rather than trying to patch the old recipe, he decided the entire approach needed to change. He set out 4 non-negotiable requirements. The ration had to be extremely portable, so a soldier could carry it without noticing the extra weight. It had to be dense with calories, since a starving man in the field would not have the luxury of a full meal. It needed a genuinely long shelf life, unlike its rancid predecessor. And critically, it could not melt in a soldier's pocket no matter how hot the climate. This was already an unusual set of demands for a piece of chocolate. But Logan was about to add one more requirement that would make his creation infamous for the next 80 years. He did not simply want a bar that met these technical specifications. He wanted a bar that soldiers would be reluctant to eat. The logic behind this decision is what makes this story so fascinating. An emergency ration exists for one purpose only: to be available in the worst possible moment, when every other source of food has run out. If that ration is genuinely delicious, human nature takes over. Hungry, bored, or simply craving something sweet, soldiers would eat their emergency supply long before any actual emergency arrived, leaving them with nothing when it truly mattered. So Logan's solution was almost psychological in nature. He needed a bar that fed the body while doing almost nothing to satisfy the appetite. It had to be good enough to swallow, but not good enough to crave. It needed to sit in a soldier's pack for weeks or even months, completely untouched, purely because nobody wanted to eat it unless they absolutely had to. To bring this vision to life, Logan knew he needed serious expertise in chocolate manufacturing, something well beyond what a military laboratory in Chicago could provide on its own. He reached out to one of the largest and most technically advanced chocolate companies in the country, a company famous for turning cocoa into products consumed by millions of ordinary Americans every single day. Their chief chemist, a man responsible for some of the company's most beloved products, was about to be handed one of the strangest assignments of his career. Instead of being asked to make something people would love, he was being asked, quite literally, to make something people would only tolerate. What emerged from that meeting was not simply a new recipe. It was the beginning of one of the most unusual food engineering challenges of the entire war. One that would blend military strategy, industrial chemistry, and human psychology into a single 4-ounce bar of chocolate. And that meeting is exactly where our next chapter begins. When Captain Logan sat down with the Hershey Company's chief chemist, he did not hand over a vague wish list. He arrived with an extremely specific set of military specifications, the kind of document you would expect for designing an engine part, not a candy bar. Every requirement had already been carefully outlined. Extreme heat resistance, a long shelf life measured in years rather than months, high caloric density and portability that would fit into a standard uniform pocket. Then came the instruction that turned this from an ordinary product briefing into something almost unheard of in the food industry. Logan told the chemist that the finished bar should taste only a little better than a boiled potato. not bland by accident, but bland by design. This was not a chemist being asked to fail at making chocolate taste good. He was being asked to succeed at making chocolate taste just good enough, and not 1 degree more. The chemist accepted the challenge and got to work on a formula that would balance function over flavor at every single step. The base ingredients were straightforward enough: chocolate liquor, sugar, and cocoa fat for structure and calories. But almost immediately, the demands of durability began fighting against the demands of taste. And taste was always going to lose that fight. The first major addition was powdered skim milk, intended to nudge the bar toward a milk chocolate flavor profile that soldiers might find more familiar and comforting. In theory, this should have softened the bar's harshness. In practice, because the powder was never rehydrated and simply mixed directly into the melted chocolate, it never fully dissolved. Instead of creating smooth milk chocolate, it introduced a grainy, slightly chalky texture that stubbornly refused to disappear no matter how long the mixture was stirred. Then came the ingredient responsible for the bar's most notorious trait of all: oat flour. This single addition was the true secret behind the bar's legendary heat resistance, absorbing fat and moisture in a way that kept the bar structurally solid even in tropical humidity. Soldiers in scorching jungle heat could carry this bar for weeks without it collapsing into a melted mess in their pocket. But that same oat flour also transformed the chocolate's texture from smooth and glossy into something closer to sand mixed with wax, permanently altering the mouthfeel of every bite. A small amount of vanillin was added next, not enough to sweeten the bar meaningfully, but enough to round off some of the harsher, more bitter notes lurking beneath all that fat and starch. Later in the war, thiamine hydrochloride, better known as vitamin B1, was folded into the recipe as well. This addition had nothing to do with flavor and everything to do with preventing beriberi, a debilitating vitamin deficiency disease that had plagued soldiers stationed in tropical regions for generations. What emerged from this careful, almost contradictory balancing act was a chocolate bar unlike anything the commercial market had ever produced. It was not pourable like ordinary melted chocolate. It behaved more like a thick, stubborn paste, refusing to flow smoothly into a mold the way a chocolatier would expect. This single detail would soon cause a very unexpected problem for Hershey's production line, one nobody had fully anticipated when the recipe was first approved. When the very first major order arrived in 1937, calling for 90,000 bars, the factory quickly discovered that their standard chocolate pouring equipment simply could not handle this unusual paste-like mixture. There was no elegant industrial solution available yet, which meant every single mold, all 90,000 of them, had to be packed entirely by hand using nothing more sophisticated than a spatula and a great deal of patience. It is a strange thing to picture. Rows of factory workers standing at long tables, physically pressing this determined, uncooperative paste into individual molds one at a time, knowing that each bar might one day end up in the hands of a soldier fighting for his life on the other side of the world. This was not glamorous chocolate making. This was industrial-scale food engineering disguised as candy production. And once those first 90,000 bars were finally packed, molded, and cooled, they were ready to be tested under conditions no ordinary chocolate bar would ever have to endure. Blazing jungle heat, freezing polar wind, and the desperate hunger of soldiers who might one day depend on this strange, stubborn bar for their very survival. That testing phase is where our next chapter takes us. A recipe on paper means nothing until it survives contact with reality. And the United States Army understood this better than almost anyone. Before this new chocolate ration could be approved for widespread military use, it needed to prove itself in some of the most punishing environments on the planet. So in 1937 and 1938, crates of this experimental bar were shipped out to American soldiers stationed in the Philippines, in Panama, in Hawaii, and even along the sun-scorched Texas border. Each of these locations was chosen deliberately for its brutal conditions. Panama and the Philippines offered relentless tropical humidity, exactly the kind of environment that had destroyed the earlier cavalry ration within months. If this new bar could survive weeks of jungle heat inside a soldier's pack without melting or spoiling, it would prove the formula's heat-resistant engineering had actually worked as intended. But the true extreme test came from somewhere far colder. Crates of this chocolate accompanied an Antarctic expedition led by Admiral Richard E. Byrd, exposing the bar to conditions almost the exact opposite of the tropical jungles. If a single formula could remain stable, edible, and calorie-dense, whether it was baking in Panama's humidity or freezing solid in Antarctic wind, the Army would know they finally had something extraordinary in their hands. The results, from a purely functional standpoint, were remarkable. The bar did not melt in tropical heat. It did not shatter or become inedible in freezing cold. During deliberately harsh starvation exercises designed to simulate real combat emergencies, it successfully kept soldiers from collapsing due to lack of calories. On every single technical measure Captain Logan had originally outlined, this new ration passed with flying colors. And then there was the other measure, the strange psychological one that made this bar so different from anything before it. Throughout all of these field trials, not a single report came back describing soldiers craving the bar or eating it ahead of schedule simply because it tasted good. Nobody was sneaking extra bites during ordinary mealtimes. Nobody was trading favors to get an additional bar. It worked exactly as intended. Reliable enough to trust, forgettable enough to ignore until genuinely needed. Based on these successful trials, the United States Army officially adopted this new ration on November 9, 1938, as its primary emergency chocolate ration. 1 year later, it received its now legendary official military designation, transforming from an experimental prototype into a standardized piece of essential wartime equipment, one that would eventually travel with millions of American soldiers around the entire globe. The official specification was refined into 3 individual 4-ounce bars of concentrated chocolate per ration unit, each one packed with roughly 600 calories. Military documentation described its exact purpose in strikingly clinical language: to provide sustenance during periods of extreme duress, when soldiers found themselves cut off from regular supply lines, or when continuous combat made normal mealtimes completely impossible to maintain. Packaging evolved quickly once the war actually began. The bars were initially wrapped in aluminum foil, but aluminum rapidly became a scarce strategic material needed for aircraft and equipment. There was also a very real fear, remembered from the previous World War, that enemy forces might resort to chemical weapons like mustard gas or chlorine gas on the battlefield. To guard against potential contamination, the wrapping was changed to waterproof cellophane, and the bars were then packed into waxed cardboard boxes clearly printed with ingredients, calorie counts, and precise instructions on how they should be eaten. Those instructions were oddly specific. Soldiers were advised to eat the bars slowly over the course of roughly 30 minutes. This was not a marketing suggestion about savoring the flavor. It was practical advice born directly from the bar's brutal, dense texture, which made rapid consumption almost physically impossible in many conditions, especially once temperatures dropped and the chocolate hardened into something closer to solid rock. As demand exploded once America fully entered the war, Hershey engineered new automated production methods, eventually scaling from 100,000 bars produced per day to an astonishing 24 million bars manufactured every single week by the war's end. Other chocolate manufacturers joined the effort too, each producing their own slightly varied versions of the same official recipe. But scaling up production was only half the story. The real test of this bar's legacy would come from the soldiers who actually had to eat it, in conditions far more desperate than any laboratory trial. And that is exactly where our next chapter begins. Statistics and factory output numbers can only tell part of this story. The real measure of this chocolate bar's legacy lives in the memories of the men who actually carried it into combat. Men who depended on it during some of the coldest, hungriest, most desperate moments of the entire war. And few of those moments were more brutal than the Battle of the Bulge, fought during one of the harshest winters in recent European history. American soldiers describe being pinned down in snow-covered forests for days at a time, cut off from regular supply lines, with almost nothing to eat beyond a small ration of cheese and whatever emergency chocolate happened to be left in their packs. In freezing temperatures, the bar hardened into something closer to a solid block of stone than anything resembling ordinary chocolate. One veteran later described trying to bite into it directly, discovering it was essentially impossible to chew, and instead having to gnaw small fragments off the edge just to extract a bit of flavor and a fraction of its calories. Yet even in that miserable, half-frozen state, it still did exactly the one job it was truly designed for. It kept exhausted, starving men alive long enough to survive until supply lines could finally be restored. Soldiers who endured the Battle of the Bulge did not necessarily remember this chocolate fondly, but many of them openly credited it with getting them through days when there was genuinely nothing else available to eat. Some soldiers discovered a clever workaround for the bar's punishing texture. Rather than fighting to chew through a rock-hard block in freezing conditions, they would shave thin curls off the bar using a knife, drop those shavings into a canteen cup, and pour in boiling water. One veteran later described the result as some of the best hot chocolate he had ever tasted in his entire life, made almost daily during his time serving in the European theater, using nothing but this stubborn wartime chocolate and a simple canteen. The bar's reach extended well beyond active combat zones, following soldiers all the way into German prisoner of war camps. Conditions inside these camps were often bleak, sometimes limited to little more than a small bowl of thin cabbage or potato soup once per day. But once a month, Red Cross parcels would arrive, and among the crackers, cigarettes, and powdered milk inside, prisoners would often find this same emergency chocolate ration waiting for them. One former prisoner described an inventive method his fellow captives developed for making the most of these meager supplies. They would cut the chocolate bar into small pieces and mix it directly with powdered milk. Then, using whatever powdered milk remained, they would whip it into something resembling cream and spoon it generously over the top, creating a small, improvised dessert that felt genuinely delicious inside the otherwise grim reality of captivity. Not every wartime story involving this chocolate bar ended so pleasantly, however. One particularly striking account comes from a pair of prisoners who managed to escape during a forced march from a German POW camp deep into enemy territory. Their only food supply for the entire desperate journey was a single bar of this emergency chocolate, stretched across days of walking through hostile land with virtually nothing else to sustain them. Eventually, desperate hunger drove them to try something far outside their normal diet. Snails discovered crawling near a roadside gutter. Their first attempt at eating them raw proved almost impossible to keep down, the taste and texture simply too foreign and unpleasant to tolerate. So they improvised a rather unusual solution, breaking off small pieces of their remaining chocolate ration and using it to coat each snail before eating it, essentially creating a crude, desperate version of chocolate-covered escargots in the middle of enemy territory. These wildly different experiences, ranging from grateful, improvised hot chocolate to reluctant chocolate-covered snails, all reveal the same fundamental truth about this ration. Its value was never fixed. It shifted dramatically, depending entirely on how desperate the situation actually was. To a soldier with other food options readily available, it might taste disappointing, gritty, and largely forgettable. To a soldier with absolutely nothing else remaining, it could feel like the single most valuable object in the entire world. One veteran, reflecting years later on his own wartime experience with this particular chocolate, admitted that the bar had been so unpleasant during his time in combat that he genuinely could not bring himself to eat ordinary chocolate again for years after finally returning home. For him, this small, dense, deliberately unremarkable bar had left a permanent, almost bitter psychological mark, one that outlasted the war itself by a very long time. But no story involving this chocolate ration is more dramatic or more tragic than the one still ahead. And that story unfolds on a life raft, drifting somewhere in the middle of the vast, unforgiving Pacific Ocean. In May of 1943, a military bomber experienced catastrophic mechanical failure and crashed into open ocean roughly 850 miles south of Oahu. Of the 11 crew members aboard that aircraft, only 3 managed to survive the crash itself, scrambling aboard 2 small, inflatable life rafts with almost nothing beyond the clothing on their backs and whatever emergency supplies had been secured on board. Among those meager supplies were 6 bars of this same emergency wartime chocolate, split between the 2 rafts, along with a handful of small tins of water. This chocolate had been specifically designed for exactly this kind of nightmare scenario. Stranded men with no access to regular food, desperately needing calories to survive until rescue eventually arrived. One of the survivors took charge of the group's dwindling supplies, carefully dividing that chocolate into small daily portions meant to stretch across an entire week of open ocean drifting. That very first night, exhausted and traumatized from the crash, the men finally fell asleep aboard their rafts, expecting to wake the following morning to a modest chocolate breakfast as originally planned. Instead, they woke to discover the entire chocolate supply completely gone. One crew member had quietly eaten all 6 bars alone during the night, consuming in a single sitting what was meant to sustain the entire group for 7 full days. Remarkably, the other survivors did not immediately turn on him, largely because they genuinely believed rescue was likely just a few days away at most. That assumption turned out to be tragically, catastrophically wrong. Instead of a matter of days, their ordeal stretched on for an almost unimaginable 47 days adrift at sea, forcing them to survive on nothing but collected rainwater, 2 albatrosses they managed to catch by hand, and fish caught using pieces of those same albatrosses as makeshift bait. Those 47 days brought violent tropical storms, repeated shark attacks against their fragile rafts, the slow agony of extreme starvation, and even a terrifying strafing run from an enemy fighter plane. On the 33rd day of this ordeal, the crew member who had eaten the entire chocolate ration in that single desperate night ultimately died from the combined effects of prolonged starvation and dehydration. The 2 remaining survivors finally reached land on day 47, only to be captured almost immediately by enemy forces and transported into a prisoner of war camp. This harrowing true story eventually became widely known, later inspiring a major feature film, forever linking this humble, deliberately bland chocolate ration to one of the most extraordinary survival stories of the entire Second World War. It stands as perhaps the most powerful illustration imaginable of exactly why this bar was engineered the way it was. Not to be enjoyed, but to endure, to stretch, and to save lives precisely when every other option had already run out. Which brings us back here, into this kitchen, where I have recreated this exact wartime formula using the original historical specifications. Unwrapping the finished bar, the color is a deep, matte brown, noticeably less glossy than any modern commercial chocolate bar. Breaking off a piece reveals that distinctive, grainy, almost sandy interior texture, exactly as countless wartime accounts consistently described it. Taking that first bite, the flavor itself is genuinely more balanced than I originally expected walking into this experiment. There is real sweetness present, and it is nowhere near as harsh or bitter as many modern retellings of this story tend to suggest. What truly stands out instead is that unmistakable texture. Dense, slightly gritty, undeniably heavy in the mouth. More reminiscent of eating a very rich, compressed protein bar than anything resembling smooth, luxurious eating chocolate. Following the improvised method soldiers themselves once used in the field, I also shaved a portion of the bar into a cup and dissolved it in boiling water. The transformation is honestly remarkable. Nearly all of that gritty, sandy texture completely disappears, leaving behind a rich, genuinely satisfying cup of hot chocolate. One that would have offered real, meaningful comfort to a cold, exhausted soldier standing somewhere along a frozen wartime front line. So was this deliberately unremarkable chocolate bar actually good in any conventional sense of that word? No, not by ordinary standards of pleasure or indulgence. But was it successful at the one specific job it was truly designed to accomplish? Based on jungle heat trials, frozen European battlefields, desperate prison camps, and 47 brutal days adrift at sea, the answer is unmistakably yes. This was never meant to be a treat. It was meant to be a promise that no matter how desperate things became, there would always be just enough left to survive one more day. There is something profoundly humbling about a piece of food engineered not to be loved, but simply to be endured. And yet that quiet, unglamorous purpose may have quietly saved more lives than almost any other ration developed during the entire Second World War. This bar never asked to be anyone's favorite. It only ever asked to still be there, waiting patiently in a pocket or a survival kit, exactly when everything else had already run out. That, I think, is the real lesson hidden inside this story. History is not only written by the meals we remember fondly and crave for the rest of our lives. Sometimes, it is written by the meals we could barely stand to finish. The ones we choked down purely because there was genuinely nothing else left. And yet somehow, quietly, those very meals carried entire armies, entire prison camps, and entire life rafts through their absolute darkest moments. If you enjoyed uncovering this strange, remarkable piece of wartime history with me today, make sure you are subscribed to Savoring History, because this is only the very first entry in an entire series exploring military rations from across the Second World War. And there are many more forgotten, fascinating stories still waiting to be told. Leave a like, drop your country and city down in the comments below, and I will see you very soon for the next chapter of this series, right here on Savoring History.